Okay, good evening, everyone. Coming to you not live from the Living Process offices. We have done landscapes in the past, but we mostly do houses and ADUs. Thank you to all the new subscribers. I'm going to be doing new content weekly, is the idea here. So, replying to several things from online intellectual adventures, let's jump right into this. Hegel. Apart from finding excuses to get someone fired, what is the purpose of politically correct language and all these him, her, zer pronouns? The short answer is magic. A magic described by Hegel and perverted by Marx. One that all of us use, often without thinking. A magic that is recklessly and accidentally, but not naively, amplified by Twitter and Facebook. So, what happens when we use it with thinking? If James Lindsay, an online intellectual whom I greatly respect, if James's recent ideas about Marxism and Hegel and wokeness and all of that, if all of this is and magical speech, if all of that is listened to, we surrender this magical social field to the cultural Marxists, or so it would seem. I don't think we should. After all, using speech to bring about a certain reality is how all of us got born when our fathers flirted with our mothers. Speech does transform reality. The serious problems come when people expect speech to transform the nature of reality. All this recently began in everyday practice, believe it or not, with politically correct speech. You know how a church changing St. Paul's works from "when I became a man" to the wooden "when I became an adult." How that was supposed to help end sexist discrimination. Beyond the shallow but often highly instrumental facade of avoiding rudeness and respecting people's feelings, the concept that James Lindsay of New Discourses raises is that there is an at-root Marxist and therefore Hegelian desire to enact a kind of social magic, where a special kind of speech socially constructs the utopian society that these ideologues strive for, namely, the classless society, the atavistic communism that arrives after a dictatorship of the proletariat. An important side note here, James and others should be cautioned that when he says things like, "we are living in Marcuse's world," the anti-capitalist, post-industrial world that the cultural Marxists desired in the theory of the 30s through the 60s, is this because they have been so conspiratorially brilliant? The protocols of the elders of Moscow? More likely, it is because they analyzed and understood how decay and conflict work, and emphasized how one might hope to accelerate the process. After all, they wanted to break the existing system before they came up with anything new. The fault, dear James, is not in the Marxists, but in ourselves. A healthy society would never flinch at revolutionary agitation. Thus were the UK and USA exempt from revolution in the past. For example, the early socialist revolutions of 1848, they slipped over the US and the UK, but Marx himself was called before a grand jury in Cologne about inciting violence because of the Communist Manifesto. Examples of both early magic speech and the reaction of early cancel culture. This revolution from speech was, as Marx argued in his Ausrede vor der Kölner Prozess, not the result of communist agitation, but of the process of history. And here, early on, a rare moment of humble honesty shines through. Marxism never drives history. It exploits it. So, James, your targets are somewhat misplaced. To do as James does and to risk becoming a monster by fighting monsters so stridently is somewhat of a wasted effort, especially because he is missing a very crucial point by entirely dismissing Hegel in the way that he does. A good gloss of Hegel's ideas summarizes, in part, Hegel describes how logic progresses along through contradictions and sublations until there are no more contradictions that can be sublated. This is the absolute, which for Hegel is the idea. This framing raises the question: what happens when this described process occurs in a kind of Taoist way, by human will attempting to identify with and harmonize with the natural? And what happens when this process occurs in a Marxist, revolutionary manner that decides that the world is unjust and wants to replace natural will with human will? The answer is ancient Egypt contrasted to the Soviet Union, or Imperial China contrasted with Mao. Societies that, yes, conservatively want to keep society in harmony with a universal ma'at, the ancient Egyptian concept of balance and justice, from which we get our scales of blind justice, or Tianming, the Chinese concept of the mandate of heaven. These are not perfect, but overall attempt to reduce conflict and pain. Confucianism is more of a top-down idea of harmonizing with this. Taoism is more of a bottom-up. They do run the risk of being rigid and stultifying. Societies that revolutionarily attempt to remove all opposition to a human concept of the ideal tend to murder millions in prison camps. There are other options. We, as U.S. citizens, are uniquely placed to take them. It is quite a trick to be able to tell the difference between Ma'at and Mao, as flawed human judgment is central to interpreting either, but that is why republics are so important. The diffusion of decision-making, the holding accountable, the adaptability. And it is why the education of shared core values and philosophy matter. And I realize not many people may be familiar with Hegel. He articulated, among many other things, the concept of dialectic. He described this as the absolute contradicted by the negative and actualized in the concrete. Later on, we describe this as thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Our world is transitioning out of the Western idea of infinite axial space, X, Y, Z, with linear progression and spiritual dualism. This was articulated by Newton, Descartes, John Locke, and others, eloquently summarized by Spengler. In this sense, Hegel's nonlinear, dialectic, anti-dualist stance that still incorporates dualism and reformulates older Near Eastern religious ideas of monism, of unified matter and spirit, this is contra-Western thought. But I contend the West is failing, and not because of these ideas, but because its own lifespan is completing. The world has changed enough that we need revised models and forms of being and behaving and acting. The West as we knew it is no longer productive. Will it be destroyed, fossilized, or replaced? The magical speech ideas of Hegel are key to this. And as I alluded to earlier, there are two main camps, the dark magic and the light magic. Both are descended from ideas of alchemy, which, as our cultural consciousness transforms, is becoming more relevant. The dark magic seeks to control the world from a standpoint of human will. The light magic seeks to bring one's own human will in harmony with it. And that is enough for today. We have framed the ground. James, you have been shooting fish in a barrel for too long. Test your aim here. This is ultimately not about cultural Marxists. They are a worthy problem, but we have much bigger fish to fry. And thank you for listening. The nuts and bolts of Hegelian magic. Next time on Living Process.